Something was already here. Not ruins, not scattered bones in the dirt. Something enormous, something deliberate, something that hummed with the organized complexity of a civilization that had figured things out, long before the people we were taught to call the discoverers ever stepped off a boat. Stand in Lower Manhattan on a Tuesday in October. Look north. The skyline is everywhere, glass and steel stacked against a gray sky. Tens of thousands of people moving through the arteries of the city like blood through a living thing. Markets, neighborhoods, hierarchies of wealth and purpose and ambition all layered on top of each other in ways that took centuries to build. Now close your eyes. Go back. Not 200 years. Not 500. Go back exactly 1,000 years to the year 1050 AD and open your eyes again. But this time, you are not standing in Manhattan. You are standing on the eastern bank of the Mississippi River in the bottomlands of what is now southwestern Illinois, 40 miles southeast of present-day St. Louis. And what you see is not a wilderness. What you see is a city, a real city, not a village, not a ceremonial gathering place, a city with neighborhoods and markets and craft districts and a governing class and religious architecture on a scale that will not be matched anywhere in North America for another 800 years. A city where the smoke of 10,000 cooking fires rises each morning into a sky that belongs, for the moment, entirely to this place. A city where the pulse of organized human life, the arguments, the commerce, the rituals, the grief, the ambition, is as real and as loud and as complex as anything happening simultaneously in Paris or Beijing or the courts of the Abbasid Caliphate. This city has a name, and it is a name that almost nobody in America has heard. Cahokia. Say it slowly. Cahokia. Feel the weight of it. It deserves weight. At its peak, and we are talking about its peak, around 1100 AD, Cahokia was home to somewhere between 10,000 and 20,000 people within the city itself, and perhaps another 10 to 15,000 in the surrounding towns and villages that formed its sphere of influence. That total population of 25 to 35,000 people made Cahokia, at that precise moment in time, larger than London. Let that land. Larger than London. In the heart of North America. Built by people who, according to the story most of us were told in school, were supposed to be wandering in small bands through a trackless wilderness, waiting for civilization to arrive from across the Atlantic. They were not wandering. They had arrived. They had organized. They had built. And what they built was so extraordinary that when the first European explorers eventually made their way into the Mississippi River Valley, by which point Cahokia had already been abandoned for 300 years, they found the remains of something they could not explain and mostly chose not to try. The mounds were still there, dozens of them. Earthen pyramids rising from the floodplain with a geometric precision that the explorers' eyes could register, but their minds refused to fully process. The largest of them, the structure we now call Monk's Mound, rose 30 meters above the surrounding landscape and covered an area larger than the Great Pyramid of Giza at its base. It was the largest earthen structure ever built in the pre-Columbian Americas, It contained more cubic feet of dirt than the Pyramid of the Sun at Teotihuacan in Mexico, and nobody had told the Europeans it was there, because the people who built it were gone. Here is what you are going to learn in this film. You are going to learn who the people of Cahokia actually were. Not the caricature of wandering primitives that a century of cultural negligence produced, but the real, historically documented, archaeologically verified people who built a functioning urban civilization in the middle of North America 1,000 years ago. You are going to learn how they built it, the engineering, the logistics, the organizational sophistication required to pile 100 million cubic feet of earth into geometric pyramids using nothing but human hands, wooden tools, and a degree of collective will that should make every assumption about prehistoric capability feel suddenly inadequate. You are going to learn what they knew, and specifically, what they knew about the sky. Because the people of Cahokia were watching the heavens with a precision that produced one of the most sophisticated astronomical observation systems in the ancient world, one that tracked the movements of the sun through an entire annual cycle, and used that tracking to organize the religious and agricultural life of an entire civilization. You are going to learn what happened in the shadows of those pyramids, the things that make Cahokia not just impressive, but genuinely unsettling. The rituals, the sacrifices, the evidence of a social hierarchy so steep and so violently enforced that it raises uncomfortable questions about the relationship between civilizational achievement and human cost. You are going to learn why they vanished. One of the greatest mysteries in North American archaeology. A city of tens of thousands of people simply stopped. The fires went out, the plazas emptied, the people scattered into the surrounding landscape, and left behind only the mounds and the artifacts and the silence. And you are going to learn what the latest technology, specifically LiDAR laser mapping from aircraft, is doing to everything we thought we knew. Because it turns out that Cahokia was even bigger than we thought, and the story it tells about ancient North America is even more extraordinary than the version that had already been extraordinary enough to be called America's Forgotten Metropolis. This is the civilization that history forgot, and it is time, at last, to remember it. But before we do any of that, I need you to understand something. Something that matters more than any single fact about Cahokia, more than any mound or artifact or carbon date. I need you to understand why you have never heard of this place, or if you have heard of it, why it felt somehow less real, less significant, less worthy of your sustained attention than Stonehenge or the Colosseum or the Pyramids of Giza. That question, why Cahokia has been invisible in the American cultural imagination for so long, is not a small question. It is not a question about archaeology or history or even education, though it touches all of those things. It is a question about whose story gets told, about which civilizations are granted the dignity of being called civilizations, about how the story of a continent was constructed to serve certain purposes and obscure others. The mounds are still there. The archaeology is still speaking. And what it is saying should change everything. Let us begin. To understand Cahokia, you first have to understand the landscape it was born from, because Cahokia was not built in spite of its environment. It was built because of it. The American bottom is what geographers call the floodplain of the Mississippi River between the confluence of the Missouri and Ohio rivers, a stretch of some 300 square kilometers of extraordinarily fertile land in what is now southwestern Illinois. The Mississippi here is not a simple channel. It is a braided, shifting, seasonally flooding system of rivers, lakes, sloughs, and backwater wetlands that produces, in the natural cycle of its floods and recessions, one of the most biologically rich environments in North America. The people who chose this place for their city understood it. They had lived near it, or near places very much like it, for thousands of years before the construction of Cahokia began. They were the descendants of a long tradition of Mississippian culture, itself the inheritor of earlier woodland period traditions that had been developing across the eastern half of North America for roughly 3,000 years. By the time Cahokia emerged as a distinct urban phenomenon around 1050 AD, the people who built it were not starting from scratch. They were the culmination of centuries of accumulated knowledge about agriculture, construction, trade, and governance. What they had figured out, above all, was corn. Maize, the cultivar that European explorers would later call Indian corn, was the energetic foundation of Cahokia's civilization in the same way that wheat was the foundation of medieval European civilization. By around 900 AD, a new variety of maize called Northern Flint had been developed or adopted that could reliably produce large yields at the latitude of the American bottom. Northern Flint is a cold-tolerant, fast-maturing variety that extended the viable growing season by weeks. Weeks that made the difference between subsistence and surplus. Surplus is civilization. This is not a metaphor. When a community produces more food than it needs for immediate consumption, it has the option, for the first time, of diverting some of its labor away from food production. It can support specialists, people who do not farm, but who produce something else that the community needs. Potters, toolmakers, traders, priests, builders, architects, astronomers. Cahokia ran on corn surplus. The agricultural productivity of the American bottom, managed and maximized by a sophisticated community of farmers who understood the land's seasonal rhythms in intimate and generations-tested ways, generated the energetic foundation that made everything else possible. The pyramids, the plazas, the organized religious life, the astronomical observation. All of it ultimately traces back to Northern Flint maize growing in the rich silt of the Mississippi floodplain. But knowing what made Cahokia possible is different from understanding how Cahokia happened. The emergence of a city of 10 to 20,000 people in the American bottom, around 1050 AD, appears in the archaeological record as something close to sudden. There is evidence of earlier settlement in the region, but the explosion of population, construction, and social complexity that marks Cahokia's peak seems to happen in the course of a few generations. A blink by archaeological standards. Something catalyzed it. Archaeologists debate what. Some argue for a charismatic founding leader. Some argue for a new religious movement that swept through the region and concentrated believers at a single sacred center. Some argue for a favorable climatic window, The medieval warm period, which brought better agricultural conditions to much of North America between roughly 900 and 1200 AD, that produced surpluses large enough to fuel rapid urban growth. The most likely answer involves all of these factors operating together. A warmer climate produced larger surpluses. Larger surpluses freed up labor. A new or intensified religious movement gave that labor a direction and a purpose. And the charismatic authority of whoever was running Cahokia at the beginning directed it all toward the construction of something unprecedented. That something was Monk's Mound. It is impossible to overstate the scale of Monk's Mound, not because the numbers are hard to find, they are right there in the archaeological literature, but because numbers of this magnitude resist emotional comprehension unless they are translated into terms the body can grasp. Monk's Mound stands 30 meters tall. That is 10 stories. Imagine standing at the base of a 10-story building and looking up at its facade. Now imagine that building is not rectangular, but pyramidal, with a base that measures 290 meters from east to west and 250 meters from north to south. That base footprint is larger than the base of the Great Pyramid of Giza. In volume terms, how much actual material is contained in the structure, Monk's Mound contains approximately 22 million cubic feet of earth. That earth was moved by hand, not by machinery, not by domesticated draft animals. The people of Cahokia had no horses, no oxen, no wheel. It was moved by human beings carrying baskets of dirt from excavation sites to construction sites, one load at a time, over the course of roughly 2 to 3 centuries of sustained effort. The number of individual basket loads required to construct Monk's Mound has been estimated at somewhere between 50 and 100 million. 100 million basket loads of dirt. The engineering behind this construction was not primitive. It was sophisticated in ways that required what we can only call geological knowledge, an understanding of how different types of earth behave under load, how moisture content affects stability, how slope angles relate to structural integrity. Analysis of the interior structure of Monk's Mound has shown that the builders did not simply pile dirt indiscriminately. They used different types of fill strategically: clay for waterproofing, sand for drainage, compacted silt for structural stability. They built in stages, allowing each stage to settle and consolidate before adding the next, which prevented the kind of catastrophic slumping that would have leveled a more casually constructed mound. This is applied geotechnical engineering. It had no name in 1100 AD, but its principles are the same principles that modern engineers apply to earthen dam construction. The people who built Monk's Mound understood those principles, not from textbooks, but from the accumulated practical experience of generations who had been building and observing earthen structures for centuries. On top of Monk's Mound stood a building. We know this from the post holes, the dark circular stains left in the soil by the decomposed wood of large structural posts that archaeologists have found in the mound's summit. The building was large, roughly 30 meters long and 15 meters wide, with walls that rose perhaps 10 meters above the mound's already elevated summit. It was, in other words, a structure visible for miles in every direction across the flat American bottom landscape. Whatever it was, a chief's residence, a temple, a combination of both, It announced its presence on the skyline with unambiguous authority. Monk's Mound was not alone. It was the centerpiece of a planned urban landscape that covered approximately 16 square kilometers and included more than 120 separate earthen mounds of various sizes and shapes. The mounds were not randomly distributed. They were organized around a series of large plazas, open, level spaces that appear to have been deliberately created and maintained by scraping and leveling the natural ground surface. The Grand Plaza, the largest of Cahokia's open spaces, covered roughly 50 hectares south of Monk's Mound. 50 hectares of flat, cleared, maintained public space in the heart of a city of tens of thousands of people. To put this in a scale that an American might feel, 50 hectares is roughly the size of 75 football fields. This was not an accident of topography. The ground surface of the Grand Plaza was deliberately leveled and maintained, requiring the removal or redistribution of enormous quantities of earth and the sustained communal effort to keep it clear and functional. What happened in the Grand Plaza? We can only partially answer that question. Archaeology finds evidence of large gatherings, the remains of fires, the traces of feast deposits, the scattered artifacts that mark places where large numbers of people came together for purposes that combined the ceremonial and the social. Markets, religious ceremonies, political gatherings, athletic competitions. The plaza was the public heart of Cahokia in the way that the Roman Forum was the public heart of Rome, a space where the organized life of the community expressed itself in its most visible and collective forms. Around the mounds and plazas, Cahokia's residential landscape stretched in every direction. Archaeological survey has identified the post patterns of thousands of individual structures. The houses, workshops, storage buildings, and specialized facilities of the city's tens of thousands of inhabitants. The distribution of these structures was not random. There is clear spatial organization. Higher status residents lived closer to the ceremonial center in better constructed houses with access to higher quality goods. Lower status residents lived farther out in more modest structures with a material culture that reflects their position in a hierarchy that was real and enforced. The goods themselves are revelatory. Cahokia was not economically isolated. It was the hub of a trade network that extended across much of eastern North America. Copper from the Great Lakes, mica from the southern Appalachians, chert, the fine-grained stone used for tools, from specific quarry sites hundreds of miles away, marine shells from the Gulf of Mexico, pottery in styles that reflect connections to communities across the Mississippi drainage and beyond. This was not casual long-distance exchange. This was organized trade, operating through networks that required relationships, maintained routes, and probably some form of standardized value. Not coinage as we know it, but something functionally analogous, a shared understanding of what certain goods were worth relative to others that allowed exchange to happen across cultural and linguistic boundaries. The craft production at Cahokia was specialized in ways that imply full-time specialists, people whose primary economic activity was the production of particular types of objects rather than food cultivation. Flint knappers who produced stone tools in specific standardized forms. Pottery makers who produced vessels in the characteristic Cahokian style with its distinctive features of paste, temper, and surface treatment. Workers in shell and copper who transformed raw materials from distant sources into prestige objects that circulated through the elite exchange networks of the Mississippian world. Full-time specialists need to be fed by someone else's agricultural surplus. Their existence implies a surplus large enough to support them, and a social system capable of directing that surplus toward their maintenance. That social system was not egalitarian. Cahokia was a ranked society, and the ranking was steep. At the top was a person, or a succession of persons, whose authority was so overwhelming that the construction of Monk's Mound was both achievable and sustained across generations. We do not know what title this person held. We do not know exactly how their authority was legitimated or transmitted. But the physical evidence of Cahokia, the scale of the ceremonial core, the control over labor that it implies, the elaborate mortuary practices we will come to shortly, speaks unambiguously to the existence of a ruling class with real coercive power. Below the ruler, a hierarchy of elites managed the city's various functions: religious, administrative, military, economic. Below them, the skilled craftspeople and specialized workers whose labor produced the goods and services the city needed. Below them, the farmers and laborers whose agricultural surplus and physical effort made everything else possible. This was not a simple chiefdom. This was something approaching, and by some definitions achieving, a state-level society, a political organization with a defined territory, a governing class, a system of taxation or tribute, and the coercive apparatus to enforce compliance. The organizational complexity required to build and maintain Cahokia at its peak is not compatible with anything simpler than a proto-state at minimum. And all of it happened without writing, without wheels, without metal tools, without draft animals, with human intelligence, accumulated knowledge, and the extraordinary capacity of organized communities to accomplish things that seem impossible when you think about them as the work of individuals rather than as the product of sustained collective effort. This is what was in America before Columbus, not wilderness, not wandering bands, a city, a civilization, a people who had solved the problems of urban organization, food supply, sanitation, construction, trade, governance, religious life, in their own way, on their own terms, using their own resources and their own accumulated genius. The mounds are still there, and they are still large enough to make you feel small. There is a moment, if you time it right, when you can stand in a particular field at Cahokia as the sun rises on the morning of the spring equinox and watch the solar disk appear to rest precisely on the summit of Monk's Mound before lifting free and climbing into the morning sky. This is not an accident of geography. It is not a coincidence of topography. It is the product of deliberate, sustained, multi-generational astronomical observation translated into architectural alignment, the same intellectual tradition that produced the solstice alignment at Stonehenge and the equinox illumination of the inner chamber at Newgrange, expressed here in the particular medium of the North American Midwest. But it is not the mound alignment that represents the most sophisticated astronomical achievement at Cahokia. That distinction belongs to a structure that no longer exists, or rather, that exists now only as a pattern of post holes in the earth, a ghost outline of what was once one of the most precisely calibrated astronomical observation instruments in the ancient world. We call it WOODHENGE. The name is borrowed from the British tradition, a deliberate echo of the wooden precursor structures that preceded the final stone phases at Stonehenge, and the parallel is apt in more ways than just the name. Like the British henges, WOODHENGE at Cahokia was a circular arrangement of large wooden posts set in the ground with their tops rising to a consistent height, arranged around a central observation point. And like the British henges, its circular geometry encoded astronomical information. The positions on its circumference where posts stood marked the rising and setting positions of the sun at key points in the solar year. The story of how WOODHENGE was discovered is itself a minor archaeological drama. In the late 1950s and early 1960s, a housing development was being built in the area west of Monk's Mound, an act of urban expansion that was proceeding with complete indifference to whatever might be buried beneath the fields. Warren Whittrey, an archaeologist with the Illinois State Museum, was conducting a survey of the area before construction began. In the aerial photographs of the site, he noticed something: a series of pits, roughly circular in arrangement, that appeared in the soil as dark stains against the lighter surrounding matrix. He recognized what he was looking at: post holes, large ones, from posts that must have been substantial. Upright timbers, perhaps half a meter in diameter, and rising several meters above the ground, and arranged in a circle with a diameter of roughly 120 meters. Subsequent investigation revealed that there was not one WOODHENGE at Cahokia. There were at least 5, built and rebuilt at roughly the same location over a period of perhaps 200 years, each slightly different in diameter and in the precise positions of its posts, as if the builders were refining and recalibrating their instrument with each iteration. The post holes from the best preserved of these circles allow us to reconstruct, with reasonable confidence, where the posts stood and what astronomical events those positions corresponded to. The result is extraordinary. Specific posts in the circle align with the rising sun on the summer solstice, the longest day of the year, when the sun reaches its northernmost point on the horizon before turning back south. Other posts align with the rising sun on the winter solstice, the shortest day, when the sun rises at its most southerly point. Still other posts mark the equinoxes, the 2 days of the year when day and night are equal, when the sun rises precisely due east. This is a solar calendar, a working, calibrated architectural solar calendar set in the earth of the American bottom 1,000 years ago. But understanding what this means requires understanding what it was for. And to understand what it was for, you have to understand the relationship between the sun and the life of the people of Cahokia. The Mississippian world was, at its foundation, an agricultural world. Everything, the food supply, the timing of planting and harvest, the great communal ceremonies that bound the social fabric together, the ritual obligations that defined the relationship between the human community and the supernatural forces that governed their world, was organized around the agricultural cycle. And the agricultural cycle was organized around the sun. When do you plant corn? When the soil temperature is right, which means after the last frost, after the nights have warmed past a critical threshold. That threshold corresponds, in the American bottom, to a particular position of the sun in its annual cycle, a particular point in the progression from winter solstice through spring equinox toward summer solstice. If you can predict that point precisely, you can optimize your planting, not just this year, but every year, with a consistency that reduces the variability in your food supply and gives your civilization a more reliable, energetic foundation. Woodhenge was how the priests of Cahokia, the people whose specialized function was the mediation between the human community and the cosmic order, tracked that progression. By standing at the central observation point of the circle and watching where on the circumference the sun rose each morning, they could locate themselves in the solar year with a precision impossible to achieve by any other means available to them. This is not primitive. This is applied astronomy. It requires sustained observation, years of watching the sun rise from the same spot, marking where on the horizon it appears each day, noting the systematic progression of that point northward, through winter, into spring, and then south again from summer through fall. It requires a system for recording those observations, not writing, but something functionally equivalent, a way of preserving the information across seasons and years and the lifetimes of individual observers. And it requires the translation of those observations into the geometry of a wooden circle, the mathematical calculation of where each post must stand so that specific horizon positions are marked precisely by specific structural elements. This is the kind of knowledge that takes generations to develop and requires a specialized class of observers to maintain. The people who built and used Woodhenge were not casual sky watchers. They were trained astronomers, operating within a tradition of sky knowledge that had been developing for centuries before the first post of the first Woodhenge was driven into the ground at Cahokia. Warren Whittree, when he first analyzed the post positions at Cahokia, described the equinox alignment as involving a post that he called the observation post, the position from which a watcher standing at the center of the circle would see the spring equinox sun rise precisely between two flanking posts, framing the solar disk in a gap that lasted only moments before the sun climbed above the level of the posts, and the alignment dissolved into the general brightness of morning. That moment, the framed sunrise, the sun positioned exactly in its alignment, the knowledge that the year has turned and the planting season is coming, is not simply a scientific observation. It is an experience. It is the kind of experience that would have been charged with religious significance for a community whose entire relationship with the cosmos was organized around the idea that the sun was a living force, that its movements were the visible expression of a divine order, and that the priests who could track and predict and ceremonially acknowledge those movements were mediating between the human community and the powers that sustained its existence. The ceremonies that took place at Woodhenge on the solstices and equinoxes were not separate from Cahokia's political and social life. They were central to it. The authority of Cahokia's ruling class, whoever they were, whatever title they held, was legitimated in part by their connection to this astronomical knowledge. The chief or priest king or paramount who stood at Woodhenge and announced the turning of the year was not just a bureaucrat reporting a date. He was a mediator of cosmic order, a person whose power derived from his proven ability to read the sky and act as the community's representative before the forces that governed the universe. This kind of religious political authority, the authority of the person who knows what the sky is doing and can communicate that knowledge to the community in ways that benefit everyone, is one of the oldest and most durable forms of human power. It is not unique to Cahokia. You find it in the astronomical alignments of Stonehenge and the Egyptian temples and the Mayan observatories and dozens of other places where ancient communities invested enormous resources in the construction of sky-watching apparatus. What it tells us about each of these places is the same. This was a community that understood the sky as a source of order and that invested real authority in the people who could read that order and translate it into the rhythms of communal life. At Cahokia, the astronomical knowledge was not frozen in stone. It was carried in the bodies and memories of a trained specialist class, refined with each generation, recalibrated with each rebuilding of the wooden circle, and expressed in the ceremonies that gathered the entire community around Woodhenge at the turning points of the solar year. It was alive. It was dynamic. And it was sophisticated enough to produce a working solar calendar that operated to a precision any modern astronomer would recognize as genuine observational astronomy. There is something else that Woodhenge tells us about Cahokia, something that the astronomical alignments by themselves do not capture. It tells us about scale. The posts of Cahokia's Woodhenge were not small. The holes they left in the ground suggest uprights that were perhaps half a meter in diameter and possibly 5 or 6 meters tall. Large timber posts that would have required substantial trees and significant labor to fell, transport, trim, and set. The forests of the American bottom had been managed for timber production for centuries, but logs of that size still required careful selection and no small logistical effort to move from forest to construction site. And then there is the rebuilding. 5 iterations of Woodhenge, built and rebuilt at roughly the same location over 2 centuries. Each rebuilding represents not just the replacement of decayed wood, but an act of recalibration, an opportunity to refine the alignment, adjust the positions of posts, incorporate new observations into the geometry of the circle. This sustained commitment to maintain an astronomical observation facility across 200 years and 5 iterations tells us something about the institutional continuity of Cahokia's skywatching tradition. It was not the project of a single, inspired individual. It was the ongoing commitment of a society that understood, at the deepest level, that its relationship with the solar cycle was not optional. The sun would keep moving whether or not anyone watched it. The question was whether the community would be ready, organizationally, ceremonially, agriculturally, when the critical moments arrived. Woodhenge was how they made sure they were ready. And the fact that it had to be rebuilt, that the posts decayed, that the geometry had to be re-established, that each new version represented a fresh act of observation and calculation and construction tells us something important about the nature of the knowledge it embodied. This was not knowledge that could be stored in an object. It lived in the practice of using it, in the transmission from teacher to student, in the act of observation repeated across seasons and generations. It was the kind of knowledge that dies when the people who hold it stop practicing it. When Cahokia fell silent, WOODHENGE fell silent with it. The posts rotted. The alignments became invisible. The ceremonies stopped. And the astronomical tradition that had been maintained at this location for 2 centuries was lost, not because it was wrong, but because the social infrastructure that had sustained it collapsed. The post holes remain. They are still there in the earth of the American bottom, preserved in the waterlogged soil like a message in a bottle from a civilization that once read the sky with extraordinary precision and used what it read to organize the life of a city. We are only now learning to read that message back. There is a mound at Cahokia that does not look like much from the outside. It is low, barely 2 meters above the surrounding ground surface, and it runs roughly east to west in a gentle, elongated ridge about 60 meters long. Compared to Monk's Mound, compared to the dozens of platform mounds and conical mounds that define Cahokia's ceremonial landscape, Mound 72 is easy to overlook. Do not overlook it. What archaeologists found inside Mound 72 when they excavated it in the 1960s constitutes some of the most important and some of the most disturbing evidence for the nature of Cahokian society ever recovered. It is evidence that forces us to confront the full complexity of what Cahokia was, not the sanitized version of a lost paradise, but the real thing, a civilization that achieved extraordinary things through the exercise of power, and that exercised that power with a violence that should be neither minimized nor sensationalized, but understood. The excavation of Mound 72 was led by Melvin Fowler of the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee in the 1960s. What Fowler found as he worked through the mound's interior was a series of burial events, multiple episodes of interment spread across what appears to have been the early and peak phases of Cahokia's fluorescence that collectively paint a detailed and unsettling portrait of how this society disposed of its dead and what that disposal reveals about its living hierarchies. The centerpiece of Mound 72's mortuary program is a burial that archaeologists refer to as the beaded burial. It consists of a man, a person of clearly high status based on everything associated with him, laid out on a bed of approximately 20,000 marine shell beads arranged in the shape of a bird. The beads came from the Gulf of Mexico. Each one had to be collected, perforated, and transported over 1,000 miles to Cahokia. The arrangement, a bird shape, wings outstretched, with the man's body at the center, is not the casual placement of grave goods. It is an elaborate, deliberate, symbolically loaded composition. The bird is significant. The falcon, specifically the peregrine falcon, was one of the most powerful symbols in the Mississippian religious world. Its image appears on pottery, on engraved shells, on copper repoussé plates found across the entire Mississippian sphere, from the Gulf Coast to the Great Lakes. The falcon was associated with the sun, with warfare, with the power of the elite class. The association between falconry and ruling power is not unique to Cahokia. You find versions of it in the iconography of elite warrior cultures from the Mississippi Valley to Mesoamerica. The man in the beaded burial was being identified in death with the falcon. He was being positioned as an embodiment of solar and martial power. his body literally resting on the wings of a cosmic bird. This is not a simple burial. It is a theological statement expressed in shell beads and careful arrangement about who this person was and what his death meant. But the beaded burial is not what makes Mound 72 disturbing. What makes Mound 72 disturbing is what else Fowler found in the mound, specifically what was found beneath and around the elite burials. In multiple locations within Mound 72, archaeologists found mass graves, not the remains of battle casualties laid out in haste, carefully prepared mass interments of individuals, mostly young women, mostly killed deliberately, whose deaths appear to have been part of the same mortuary ceremonies that produced the beaded burial and the other elite interments in the mound. The numbers are striking. One pit contained the remains of approximately 53 young women, aged between 15 and 30, buried in a neat double layer. Another contained more than 20 individuals of various ages and sexes. The skeletal remains show evidence of deliberate killing. In some cases, evidence of strangulation. In others, of beheading or the removal of hands. These were human sacrifices, not the casual violence of warfare, not the ritual disposal of enemies, but the systematic killing of what appear to have been members of Cahokian society itself, sacrificed, most likely, to accompany and empower the elite dead, to serve the high-status burials in death, as they, or others like them, had presumably served the elite in life. The evidence suggests that the sacrifice of retainers at elite funerals was not a one-time anomaly at Cahokia. Multiple lines of evidence point to a recurring practice, the careful preparation of mass graves within mortuary mounds, the consistent demography of the sacrificed individuals. Young women appear with particular frequency, and the spatial relationship between mass graves and elite burials that implies a systematic funerary program rather than isolated incidents. This is deeply uncomfortable. And it should be deeply uncomfortable. The discomfort is appropriate, not because it tells us that the people of Cahokia were uniquely monstrous. Human sacrifice in the service of elite power is documented across an extremely wide range of ancient civilizations, including many that Western scholarship has consistently romanticized. But because it forces us to hold two truths simultaneously. Truth 1. Cahokia was a civilization of genuine achievement. Its urban organization, its astronomical knowledge, its artistic production, its trade networks, its architectural ambition, all of these represent real intellectual and social accomplishment at a level that commands genuine respect. Truth 2. Cahokia was a civilization built on the exercise of power that included, at its apex, the coercive sacrifice of human beings in the service of elite interests. These two truths are not contradictions. They are the same thing. The organizational capacity that produced Monk's Mound was the same organizational capacity that produced the mass graves in Mound 72. The authority structure that could direct the labor of thousands of people toward the construction of a pyramid could also direct the labor of ritual specialists toward the preparation of human sacrifices. The religious system that legitimated the power of Cahokia's rulers in the eyes of the population was the same religious system that provided the framework within which sacrifice made sense. This is not a Cahokian peculiarity. It is a pattern. Ancient Egypt built its pyramids with organized labor, directed by a theocratic ruling class. The same theocratic ruling class kept slaves, conducted human sacrifice in early periods, and maintained its authority through a combination of religious legitimation and genuine coercion. Mesopotamian city-states built ziggurats and legal codes and writing systems. They also kept slaves and conducted ritual killings and maintained elaborate systems of inequality enforced by violence. The classical world, Athens, Rome, produced democracy and philosophy and literature. It also ran on slave labor and conducted mass executions and maintained its social order through systematic violence. The achievement and the violence are not separable. They are, at some level, two faces of the same phenomenon: the organization of large numbers of human beings under centralized authority, which enables collective accomplishment on scales impossible for smaller and less hierarchical groups, but which also concentrates the capacity for coercion and demands human cost for its maintenance. Cahokia is part of that human story, not a uniquely dark chapter and not an innocent paradise, a complex, real, historically situated civilization that achieved remarkable things and paid for them in the currency all large-scale civilizations pay: the subordination of the many to the purposes of the few, enforced by the full weight of the social and supernatural authority those few could command. The women buried in the mass graves of Mound 72 deserve to be remembered, not as evidence that Cahokia was exceptional in its cruelty, but as evidence that Cahokia was fully human, capable of the full range of human behavior, from the architectural genius of Monk's Mound to the horror of ritual killing, from the astronomical precision of Woodhenge to the violence of the mass grave. Archaeology has been slow to acknowledge the sacrifice evidence at Cahokia. There is a long tradition in American scholarship of treating the indigenous civilizations of North America with a combination of romanticization and condescension, portraying them either as noble innocents living in harmony with nature, or as too primitive to have produced anything worth studying seriously. Both of those portraits are false. The truth is more complex, more human, and ultimately more interesting than either. The people of Cahokia were not noble innocents. They were a civilization, and civilizations, as history consistently demonstrates, are complicated. The Mound 72 evidence forces that complication into view with a directness that is impossible to sentimentalize away. 20,000 shell beads arranged in a falcon shape around a man of extraordinary status. 53 young women in a carefully prepared mass grave beneath him. This is Cahokia at its peak, beautiful and terrible, sophisticated and violent, fully human in all the ways that humanity is genuinely difficult to love. There is something else in Mound 72 that deserves attention, something that points not just to the violence of Cahokian society, but to its reach and its symbolic complexity. The orientation of the mound itself is astronomical. Mound 72 is aligned on an axis that points to the position of the sun at the summer solstice sunrise. The mound, in other words, is not just a burial structure. It is an astronomical marker, its very orientation encoding the same solar knowledge that was expressed in the wooden circles of Woodhenge. The elite dead of Cahokia were buried not just in the earth, but in alignment with the sky, their tombs oriented toward the most powerful moment of the solar year. This connection between the solar calendar and the mortuary program is not coincidental. It reflects a worldview in which the cycles of the sun and the cycles of social power were not separate phenomena, but aspects of a single cosmic order. The ruler, the person whose burial was marked with 20,000 shell beads, was the solar representative on Earth, the human embodiment of the Falcon's solar power. His death did not sever that connection. It transformed it. The burial in the solar-aligned mound, accompanied by the sacrificed retainers, was a ceremony of cosmic maintenance, a way of ensuring that the solar order continued through the crisis of the ruler's death. This is a coherent theological system. You do not have to agree with it, and its human cost is clearly a reason not to. But you have to recognize it as a system, a structured and internally consistent framework for understanding the relationship between human society, natural power, and cosmic order. It is not superstition, it is theology. And it is the theology that made Cahokia possible. At some point in the 13th century, archaeologists argue about the exact timing, but the consensus settles somewhere between 1200 and 1400 AD. The city of Cahokia began to die, not all at once. Cities rarely die all at once. They die the way organisms die. First the extremities, then the core, and finally the vital centers that had sustained everything else. In Cahokia's case, the outer settlements appear to have been abandoned first, their populations either contracting toward the city center or dispersing into the wider landscape. Then the city itself began to thin. Fewer houses, fewer hearths, fewer of the material signatures of dense urban occupation. The great plaza ceremonies became less frequent or stopped entirely. The construction of new mounds ceased. The trade networks that had brought copper from Lake Superior and shells from the Gulf of Mexico contracted and eventually dissolved. And then, sometime in the century between 1300 and 1400 AD, the last fires went out. The last residents left. The plazas of the city that had once been the largest urban center north of Mexico were empty and would remain empty for centuries, slowly being reclaimed by the vegetation that had been pushed back when the city was built. Why? This is the question that has occupied Cahokia researchers for decades, and the honest answer is, we do not know with certainty. What we have instead is a set of hypotheses, each supported by evidence, each incomplete, and each pointing toward a different dimension of the catastrophe that ended Cahokia. The first hypothesis is climate. The medieval warm period, the climatic window of relatively favorable temperatures that had boosted agricultural productivity across much of North America between roughly 900 and 1200 AD, ended. Its replacement, the Little Ice Age, brought cooler temperatures, more variable precipitation, and reduced agricultural productivity to the American bottom and the broader Mississippian world. Crops that had reliably produced surplus during the warm centuries became unreliable. Famines, or at least chronic food insecurity, became more common. The evidence for climatic stress at Cahokia is real and documented. Isotope analysis of human skeletal remains from the city's later periods shows dietary signatures consistent with nutritional stress, people eating less well, relying on less diverse and less reliable food sources. The proportion of maize in the diet appears to have actually increased in the later periods, which sounds paradoxical until you realize that a population under food stress may intensify its dependence on its primary crop, even as conditions make that crop less reliable. A positive feedback loop of agricultural vulnerability that can rapidly become catastrophic. The second hypothesis is environmental degradation. A city of 20,000 people in a pre-industrial landscape places extraordinary demands on its surrounding environment. The forests of the American bottom were cleared for agricultural land, for building material, for fuel, at a rate that eventually outpaced natural regeneration. Deforestation causes soil erosion, which reduces agricultural productivity, which increases pressure on the remaining agricultural land, which accelerates further degradation. Deforestation also affects hydrology. Without forest cover to regulate runoff, the flooding patterns of the Mississippi and its tributaries become more erratic, which can be catastrophic for a civilization whose agricultural system depends on the managed flooding of bottomland fields. The palynological evidence, the analysis of ancient pollen preserved in lake sediments and peat bogs in the Cahokia region, shows a dramatic decline in tree pollen and a corresponding increase in grass and agricultural pollen during Cahokia's peak, followed by a complex recovery pattern as the city declined. The forest was cut down. And while parts of it recovered after the city's collapse, the recovery took centuries and may have produced a landscape significantly different from what had existed before. The third hypothesis is political. Large, centralized states are inherently unstable. The concentration of power at the center that makes their achievements possible is also the source of their greatest vulnerability. When that center fails, through the death of a key leader, through the loss of legitimacy of the ruling class, through internal conflict over succession or resources, the entire structure can unravel with frightening speed. At Cahokia, the evidence for political instability in its later phases is suggestive, if not conclusive. The construction of a wooden palisade, a defensive wall, around the ceremonial core of the city sometime in the 12th century is one of the most striking pieces of evidence. Cities build walls when they feel threatened. The wall at Cahokia enclosed the most sacred and politically important area of the city, which means it was the center that felt the need for protection. Protection from whom? The answer most likely involves internal conflict. A defensive wall makes more sense as protection against the city's own peripheral population. Groups who had become alienated from the ruling class, whose access to resources had declined, who had reason to be angry at the center that claimed authority over them, than as protection against external enemies, for whom no specific archaeological evidence exists. The palisade was rebuilt multiple times, which suggests that the threat it was built against was persistent and real, and the timing of its construction, coinciding roughly with the beginning of Cahokia's population decline, is suggestive of a connection. The city began building walls around the time its hold on its hinterland population began to loosen. The fourth hypothesis is ideological. Religious authority is the most powerful and the most fragile form of legitimation. It is the most powerful because it connects the ruler's claim to power to the cosmic order itself. The ruler is not just strong, not just wealthy, not just militarily dominant, but is the representative of divine power on Earth, the mediator between the human community and the forces that sustain the universe. When this legitimation works, it is extraordinarily effective. People are willing to do things for a divine king that they would not do for a merely powerful one. But it depends on results. The sun still rises, the crops must still grow. When the crops fail, when the rains do not come, when the famines that the ruling class was supposed to prevent arrive anyway, the divine king has failed. And failed divine kings do not simply lose elections. They lose their claim to exist as divine kings. At Cahokia, the combination of climatic deterioration and environmental degradation created conditions in which the agricultural productivity that had been the material foundation of elite authority began to decline. The ceremonies that were supposed to ensure good harvests failed to produce good harvests. The priests and rulers who had derived their authority from their claimed ability to mediate the relationship between the community and the cosmic order were confronted with evidence, visible, tangible, unavoidable evidence in the form of failing crops and food insecurity. That their mediation was not working. Under these conditions, the ideological legitimation of the ruling class could collapse quickly. A population that has been enduring sacrifice, tribute, and subordination in exchange for the promise of cosmically guaranteed prosperity has limited patience when the prosperity fails to materialize. The abandonment of Cahokia may not have been simply a migration of people seeking better agricultural conditions elsewhere. It may have been, at least in part, a rejection, a deliberate turning away from a religious and political system that had failed to deliver on its central promise. This would explain a pattern visible in the archaeological record: the apparent intentional destruction of some of Cahokia's most sacred structures as the city declined. Evidence suggests that some of the wooden posts of WOODHENGE were deliberately pulled from the ground rather than simply left to decay. If true, this is not the behavior of a population that has simply moved on. It is the behavior of a population that is actively dismantling the sacred infrastructure of a system they are repudiating. The fifth hypothesis is population dispersal. None of the above hypotheses requires that the people of Cahokia died. The evidence suggests that the population declined, but the people did not simply vanish. They dispersed into the surrounding landscape, into smaller communities, into the broader Mississippian world that continued to function in modified and often reduced forms across the eastern half of North America for another 3 centuries before European contact. This dispersal is documented in the archaeology of the region. Communities in the middle and lower Mississippi Valley show the influence of Cahokian culture, the pottery styles, the iconographic symbols, the ceremonial mound complexes, in forms that represent the adoption and adaptation of Cahokian cultural elements by communities that absorbed immigrants from the dying city. The people went somewhere. They took their knowledge, their craft traditions, their religious frameworks with them. They were absorbed into and became part of other communities, other traditions, other ways of organizing the relationship between human life and the landscape. This means that the end of Cahokia was not the end of Mississippian civilization. It was a transformation, painful, disruptive, and costly in human terms, but not an annihilation. The descendants of Cahokia's population continued, in dispersed and modified form, across a wide swath of North America. Some of the nations that European colonizers would encounter in the 16th and 17th centuries were likely the cultural heirs, however many generations removed, of the people who had built Monk's Mound. The tragedy of Cahokia's collapse is real. The loss of the organizational capacity that built the city, the loss of the astronomical knowledge that oriented Woodhenge, the loss of the craft traditions and trade networks and ceremonial life that had made Cahokia the largest city in North America. All of that was genuinely lost. It was not recovered. When European colonizers arrived in the Mississippi Valley, they found communities that bore cultural traces of the Mississippian tradition, but nothing that resembled the urban scale and organizational complexity of Cahokia at its peak. What they found instead were the mounds. Silent, enormous, covered in vegetation. Utterly mysterious to observers whose frameworks for understanding the ancient world had no category for a pre-Columbian North American city. And so began the second tragedy of Cahokia, the erasure of its memory from the story that Americans would tell about their continent. On a clear morning in 2010, a small aircraft flew back and forth across the American bottom in a systematic grid pattern, its belly pointed toward the Earth below. The aircraft was equipped with a LiDAR instrument, a device that fires pulses of laser light at the ground 50,000 times per second and measures the time it takes for each pulse to return to the sensor after reflecting off whatever surface it hits. The result, when processed by the algorithms that convert time-of-flight data into spatial coordinates, is a point cloud, a three-dimensional map of the ground surface accurate to within a few centimeters. The key feature of LiDAR for archaeological purposes is its ability to see through vegetation. Laser pulses that pass through gaps in a forest canopy and reach the ground surface return data from that surface rather than from the canopy. The software can separate ground returns from vegetation returns and produce, in effect, a map of the ground as if the vegetation were not there. What the 2010 survey revealed beneath the vegetation of the Cahokia region was not what researchers expected, or rather, it was far more than what researchers expected. The known extent of the Cahokia site, based on conventional archaeological survey, encompassed the major mound group and its immediate surroundings. Roughly 16 square kilometers of mapped and documented archaeological features. LiDAR extended the picture dramatically. The laser data revealed archaeological features, earthworks, mound outlines, plaza boundaries, causeways, extending well beyond the known boundaries of the site into areas that had been thought to be uninhabited or minimally occupied. The full extent of the Cahokian landscape, as revealed by LiDAR, is still being processed and interpreted. But the preliminary results have consistently pushed the picture in the same direction. Cahokia was bigger than we thought, not marginally bigger, substantially bigger. The city and its associated landscape of mounds, plazas, agricultural fields, and satellite communities may have extended over an area 2 to 3 times larger than previously documented. LiDAR has been particularly revealing in several specific ways. First, it has clarified the relationship between the known mound groups at Cahokia and the surrounding landscape. What appeared from ground-level survey and conventional aerial photography to be isolated or loosely connected mound groups are revealed by LiDAR to be part of a more highly structured landscape, connected by causeways oriented to each other in ways that imply deliberate planning, and surrounded by areas of deliberate landscape modification that were not previously recognized as archaeological features. Second, LiDAR has revealed a previously unknown system of borrow pits, the excavations from which the earth for mound construction was taken. The borrow pits at Cahokia are enormous. Some of them are large enough to have been lakes after they filled with water, and the largest of them cover areas comparable to multiple city blocks. The distribution and size of the borrow pits tells us something new about the logistics of mound construction, where the earth came from, how far it had to be moved, and what the resulting changes to the local hydrology meant for the agricultural system. Third, and perhaps most significantly for understanding Cahokia's social complexity, LiDAR has revealed evidence of landscape features that appear to correspond to the agricultural infrastructure of the city's support system. Ridge and swale fields, low earthen ridges separating drainage channels, a form of raised field agriculture adapted to the seasonal flooding of the American bottom, appear in the LiDAR data in areas that had not been previously recognized as agricultural zones. The extent of these agricultural features suggests a far more intensive and deliberately engineered agricultural system than previously documented. This matters enormously for understanding how Cahokia fed itself. The population estimates of 10 to 20,000 people within the city proper, plus another 10 to 15,000 in satellite communities, require a food production system of considerable scale. Previous models of Cahokia's agriculture had struggled to account for how the available land, farmed with the techniques assumed to have been available, could have fed that many people. The ridge and swale field system revealed by LiDAR suggests a possible answer: a sophisticated raised field agriculture that dramatically increased the productive use of the American bottom's seasonally flooded terrain. Raised field agriculture, the construction of low earthen platforms above the flood level with drainage channels between them, is a sophisticated response to the agricultural challenges of floodplain environments. It allows year-round cultivation of land that would otherwise be productive only during the dry season. It allows precise water management, since the channels can be used to both drain excess water during floods and retain water during dry periods. And it dramatically increases the amount of productive agricultural land available in a given landscape by transforming marginal wetland terrain into high-productivity cultivation beds. The ridges and swales visible in Cahokia's LiDAR data appear to represent exactly this kind of deliberate agricultural infrastructure, engineered not just for one season, but for sustained, high-productivity use across many years. If confirmed by ground-level investigation, which is ongoing, this discovery would substantially revise our understanding of Cahokia's agricultural capacity and, by extension, its population potential and organizational complexity. LiDAR has also been revealing about the spatial organization of the broader Cahokian landscape, the satellite mound groups that surround the main Cahokia site. East St. Louis Mound Group, St. Louis Mound Group, the big mound that was destroyed in the 19th century, and the various smaller groups scattered across the American bottom, appear in LiDAR data to be connected to the main site through a network of causeways and aligned earthworks that suggest deliberate planning at a landscape scale. This landscape scale planning is significant. It means that Cahokia was not just a city in the modern sense, a dense concentration of population and built infrastructure, but an organized ceremonial and political landscape in the same sense that the Avebury Stonehenge landscape in Britain is an organized ceremonial and political landscape, a territory whose entire spatial organization expressed a coherent system of meaning in which the relationship between different elements was deliberate, planned, and symbolically significant. The practical implications of this landscape scale organization extend beyond the symbolic. A network of causeways connecting the main mound groups to each other and to the surrounding agricultural and residential zones would have had enormous practical benefits for the movement of goods, people, and information across the Cahokian landscape. It would have facilitated the collection of agricultural tribute from the satellite communities, the distribution of prestige goods from the city center, and the organization of the large-scale ceremonial gatherings that bound the Cahokian world together. LiDAR has also been producing results at specific known sites within the Cahokia landscape that have substantially revised earlier interpretations. The Monk's Mound itself has been LiDAR surveyed in detail, and the resulting data has revealed features of the mound's construction and modification history that were not visible to previous investigators. The mound was not built in a single campaign, as earlier researchers sometimes assumed. The LiDAR data confirms the staged construction visible in earlier coring studies and adds detail about how successive construction phases related to each other and to the surrounding landscape. Perhaps the most intriguing result from LiDAR at Cahokia involves a series of features identified in the data that do not correspond to any previously known or expected site type. These features, low, linear earthworks visible in the LiDAR data as subtle ridge and furrow patterns, appear to extend across areas of the American bottom in ways that suggest a degree of landscape organization even more pervasive than the mound complexes and agricultural fields alone would imply. What are they? The honest answer is, we do not yet know. They are currently the subject of active archaeological investigation, and until that investigation produces definitive results, responsible interpretation requires acknowledging the uncertainty. But the scale and distribution of these features suggests the possibility that the managed and symbolically organized landscape of Cahokia extended much further and was organized at a much finer spatial resolution than previous investigation had revealed. This is the frontier of Cahokian research. It is a frontier that LiDAR has opened by revealing the shape of things that were there all along, but invisible to the tools previously available. The mounds were always there. The agricultural earthworks were always there. The causeways were always there. LiDAR did not create them. It revealed them. And in revealing them, it has made Cahokia larger, more extensive, more complex, more deliberately organized, and more impressive. than the version that previous generations of researchers had been able to document. This is the pattern that the history of Cahokian research consistently produces. Every new tool, every new technique, every new line of investigation reveals not the limits of Cahokia's achievement, but its further extent. The city keeps growing, the complexity keeps deepening, the sophistication of the civilization that built it keeps becoming more apparent. There is a lesson in this for how we approach the archaeology of North America more broadly. The story of Cahokia is, in part, a story about what gets found when people actually look, and about how systematically American society has failed to look. The mounds of the American bottom have been visible since the first European settlement of the region. They were noticed and documented and speculated about by observers from the colonial period onward. And for most of that time, the speculation was directed at anyone except the obvious answer, that they were built by indigenous people, the ancestors of the Native American nations, that European colonization would subsequently devastate. Instead, the mounds were attributed to the Toltecs, to the Phoenicians, to the Welsh, to the lost tribes of Israel, to a vanished race of mound builders who were, in the speculations of the era, specifically not the ancestors of contemporary Native Americans. The cultural machinery that produced these theories was not archaeology. It was ideology, the ideology of a colonizing society that needed the continent to have been empty, or at least uninhabited by anyone sufficiently civilized to count, in order to justify the dispossession that was actively underway. LiDAR cannot fix that history, but it can continue the work of replacing the mythology with the reality. And the reality, as Cahokia increasingly reveals it, is extraordinary. In 1811, Henry Marie Brackenridge, a traveler and writer, visited the mounds of the American bottom and described what he saw in a letter to Thomas Jefferson. He wrote, with what seems in retrospect like prophetic anxiety, that if mounds of this kind had been discovered in any part of Europe, they would have excited the greatest curiosity and become an object of the most careful investigation. But situated in what has been called the far west of American settlement, they remain almost entirely unknown. He was right to be anxious. The fate of the mounds in the following century and a half was not investigation. It was destruction. The city of St. Louis sits immediately west of the American bottom, across the Mississippi River, from the core of the Cahokia site. In the 19th century, as St. Louis grew from a frontier trading post into a major American city, its expansion consumed the mound groups on both sides of the river with almost total efficiency. The St. Louis Mound Group, the big mound that had stood nearly 30 meters tall on the west bank of the Mississippi, was demolished for fill in the 1860s, its contents scooped out by workers who found and discarded human remains and artifacts with complete indifference to what they were destroying. The East Street Louis Mound Group, on the Illinois side, suffered the same fate over the following decades. Mound after mound was plowed flat, quarried for fill, built over, or simply allowed to be eroded by agricultural activity. Of the dozens of mounds that had stood in the East St. Louis group when European settlement arrived, virtually none survive today. Even the main Cahokia site was not safe. Through the 19th and early 20th centuries, agricultural plowing, road construction, and residential development progressively damaged and destroyed archaeological features across the site. The situation became acute enough by the early 20th century that archaeologists began to argue with increasing urgency for some form of legal protection. That protection came eventually, but slowly, partially, and in ways that reflected the broader cultural indifference to the significance of what was being protected. Cahokia Mound State Historic Site was established in stages across the 20th century, with the core of the site, including Monk's Mound, receiving state protection before the outlying portions of the landscape. Even today, the protected area does not encompass the full extent of the Cahokian landscape as understood by modern research, and development pressure on the unprotected margins of the site continues. UNESCO designated Cahokia a World Heritage Site in 1982. This designation placed Cahokia in the same category of global cultural significance as the Egyptian pyramids, Stonehenge, and the Great Wall of China. It is precisely the recognition that the mounds deserve, and yet the average American, who could tell you that the pyramids of Giza are one of the wonders of the ancient world, would be hard-pressed to locate Cahokia on a map or describe what it is. Why? The answer involves history and ideology, and the specific ways in which American culture has constructed its relationship with its own past. The narrative of American national identity, the story Americans tell themselves about who they are and where they come from, has consistently centered on the period of European colonization and the subsequent development of the Republic. The pre-Columbian past has occupied, in this narrative, a position that is at once symbolically important and empirically marginalized. Important as the backdrop against which the drama of exploration and settlement unfolds, but marginalized as the source of anything that counts as civilization in the terms the narrative recognizes. The people who built Cahokia do not fit comfortably in this narrative. They are too sophisticated to play the role of the primitive savage waiting to be civilized. They are too fully civilizational, too urban, too organized, too astronomically knowledgeable, too architecturally ambitious to be relegated to the status of background to the story of European discovery. But they are not European. They cannot be incorporated into the narrative of Western civilization's advance without fundamentally revising what that narrative means. The revision has been happening slowly and unevenly through the 20th century and into the 21st. Archaeology has steadily accumulated the evidence that makes the old narrative untenable. But the pace at which scholarly knowledge translates into popular understanding is slow, and the resistance, cultural, ideological, and in some cases explicitly political, is real. There is also the matter of names. We call the people who built Cahokia by various archaeological terms: Mississippian, late woodland, ancient Cahokians, but we do not know what they called themselves. The descendants of Cahokia's population were dispersed and absorbed into other communities over the centuries following the city's collapse, and the specific cultural identity of Cahokia's builders was not preserved in the oral traditions of any single surviving nation in a recoverable form. This makes it harder to attach the narrative to a community with a living voice, a contemporary political presence, a group of people who can say, "This was our city. These were our ancestors. This is our history." Multiple nations have potential historical connections to the Cahokia region and the Mississippian cultural tradition, the Osage, the Quapaw, the Chickasaw, and others. But the specific genealogical and cultural lines connecting them to Cahokia are complex and contested. This is not an argument against Native American connections to the site. It is an argument for the historical complexity of a situation that has been further complicated by 3 centuries of colonization, forced removal, and cultural disruption that severed many of the connections between living communities and their pre-Columbian heritage. The mounds are, in a sense, their own argument. They do not need a named living community to speak for them, though such communities have every right to speak about them. They speak for themselves in the language of earth and geometry and deliberate construction, in the alignment of Monk's Mound toward the equinox sunrise and the pattern of post holes that mark the vanished circle of Woodhenge. They are the surviving voice of a civilization that produced them with intention, with knowledge, and with a commitment to permanence. And they have been, for most of American history, a voice that the culture refused to hear. That refusal is changing. The LiDAR surveys, the new excavations, the sophisticated analysis of ancient DNA and isotopes and palynological data, all of it is contributing to a picture of pre-Columbian North America that is fundamentally incompatible with the old mythology of an empty continent awaiting civilization. But the deepest change is not in the data. It is in the willingness to ask different questions, to approach the mounds not with the assumption that they must be explained by reference to more obviously civilized influences, but with the openness to find in them the evidence of intelligence, organization, and achievement that was always there, waiting for eyes willing to see it. The city did not forget itself. We forgot it. And the process of remembering, which is also the process of revising the story we tell about America, is one of the most important intellectual projects of our time. There is a field in southwestern Illinois where, if you stand at the right place at the right time, you can watch the sun rise on the spring equinox and see it lift, enormous and orange, directly above the summit of the largest earthen structure in the Western Hemisphere. The moment lasts only seconds before the sun climbs free of the alignment and the ordinary morning reasserts itself. But for those seconds, you are standing in a place that was carefully chosen 1,000 years ago to produce exactly this experience. You are standing in the middle of a city that most Americans do not know existed. Cahokia matters, not as a curiosity, not as an archaeological footnote, but as a fundamental revision of the story Americans tell about their continent and themselves. Here is what the evidence of Cahokia actually tells us. First, North America was not empty when Europeans arrived. It was not a wilderness awaiting settlement. It was a continent with a deep and complex human history, one that included, at various times and in various places, levels of urban organization, agricultural sophistication, and civilizational complexity that rival or exceed what was happening simultaneously in much of Europe. This is not a claim that needs to be made tentatively. The archaeology supports it without qualification. Cahokia at its peak was larger than London. Its architecture was sophisticated, its social organization was complex, its astronomical knowledge was precise, and its economic networks were extensive. These are not the characteristics of a primitive people. They are the characteristics of a civilization. Second, the story of American history does not begin in 1492. It begins at least 12,000 years earlier, when the first human beings walked onto the continent from the north and began the long process of learning, adapting, and building that would eventually produce, among many other things, Cahokia. The European colonization of North America was not the introduction of civilization to a wild place. It was the collision of one set of civilizations with another, and the subsequent and largely deliberate erasure of the history of one of those civilizations. Third, the erasure itself tells us something. The mythology of the empty continent, the theory of the Mound builders as a vanished race distinct from contemporary Native Americans, the consistent attribution of any impressive pre-Columbian achievement to external influences, all of these are not innocent misunderstandings. They are ideologically motivated constructions that served the interests of a colonizing society that needed to believe the land it was taking had never belonged to anyone who counted. Archaeology has been dismantling this mythology for over a century, but the demolition of the mythology has not kept pace with the accumulation of evidence. The textbooks, the cultural conversations, the mental maps most Americans carry of their own national past, all of these lag far behind what the science actually shows. Cahokia is the most dramatic case in point because it is the most impossible to explain away. You cannot attribute Monk's Mound to coincidence or to the work of a wandering band of primitive hunter-gatherers. A pyramid larger than the base of the Great Pyramid of Giza, constructed with sophisticated geotechnical knowledge, centered in a planned urban landscape that covered 16 square kilometers and housed tens of thousands of people. This is not something that the mythology of the empty continent can absorb. It has to be acknowledged, or it has to be ignored. For most of American history, it has been ignored, and the ignoring has not been passive. It has been active, the physical destruction of the mounds, the dismissal of the people who built them as a separate and extinct race, the consistent failure to include Cahokia in the narrative of American history at the level its significance demands. The LiDAR revolution is making this kind of active ignorance progressively harder to maintain. Every new survey, every new dataset, every new peer-reviewed paper on the extent and complexity of the Cahokian landscape adds to a body of evidence that is already overwhelming. The city is too big, the achievement too clear, the evidence too precisely documented to remain comfortably invisible. There is a broader lesson here that extends beyond Cahokia, beyond North America, beyond any particular archaeological site or civilization. It is a lesson about how we construct historical narratives and whose interests those narratives serve. The Victorian framework of civilizational progress, the idea that human history is a single story of linear advance from primitive to civilized, with European civilization at the apex and everyone else arranged in a hierarchy of development behind it, was not a neutral description of the evidence. It was a political tool, constructed to serve the purposes of societies that were actively engaged in the subordination and colonization of the non-European world. The evidence of Cahokia, like the evidence of the megalithic monuments of Britain, like the evidence of the great civilizations of sub-Saharan Africa, like the evidence of the sophisticated agricultural societies of the Amazon. All of it sits awkwardly within this framework because all of it demonstrates that civilizational achievement is not the monopoly of any single tradition, any single lineage, any single cultural family. Human beings, given enough time, enough stability, and enough collective will figure things out. They will develop agriculture and organize cities and build monuments and watch the sky and construct systems of meaning that make sense of the relationship between human life and the larger order of which it is part. They will do this in the American bottom and on the Salisbury Plain and in the Nile Valley and in the highlands of Mexico and in the river valleys of China and in the forests of the Amazon. They will do it in their own way, using their own resources, in dialogue with their own landscapes, expressing their own forms of genius. Cahokia is one expression of that genius. Extraordinary, specific, deeply rooted in the particular ecology and history of the Mississippi River Valley, and yet recognizable as human in all the ways that matter. The ambition to build something that would last, the curiosity to understand the sky, the social complexity that comes with the organization of large numbers of people toward collective purposes, and the human cost that such organization inevitably involves. We owe Cahokia's builders the dignity of accurate history. We owe the people who were displaced and dispossessed in the centuries after European contact, people whose connections to this landscape and its history run far deeper than any claim that can be made by the inheritors of that dispossession. The honesty of acknowledging what was here before and what was lost. And we owe ourselves, all Americans, regardless of ancestry, the revision of the story we tell about the continent we live on. A story that begins with the Americas already inhabited by complex, sophisticated, historically continuous civilizations. A story in which Cahokia is not a footnote or a curiosity, but a landmark. One of the places where the depth and diversity of human achievement is most clearly and most dramatically visible. The mounds are still there. Monk's Mound still rises 30 meters above the American bottom, still aligned with the equinox sunrise, still visible for miles across the flat Illinois landscape. It has been there for 1,000 years. It will be there for 1,000 more. The question is not whether Cahokia is significant enough to deserve our attention. It is whether we are ready, at last, to pay attention. The stones stood silent for centuries, waiting. America, these mounds have been waiting too. Stand at the base of Monk's Mound on a November morning, when the light is low and the Illinois landscape stretches flat and enormous in every direction, and try to feel what you are standing next to, not what you know about it. Not the numbers, the 30 meters, the 22 million cubic feet, the 100 million basket loads of earth moved by human hands over 2 centuries of sustained effort. Not the intellectual facts about the astronomical alignments, or the trade networks, or the hierarchy of elites and sacrificed retainers documented in the archaeology. Try to feel it. A city stood here. A city with smoke and noise and the smell of cooking fires and the sound of arguments in a language no living person speaks. A city where people woke up each morning, fed their children, argued with their neighbors, went to market, prayed to the sun, attended ceremonies at the base of this mound, and made the thousands of daily decisions that constitute the texture of a life. A city where ambition operated, and power was exercised, and beauty was created, and terrible things were done in the service of beliefs that made complete sense within the framework that produced them. A city that reached up from the floodplain of the Mississippi River and touched, in its most expansive moments, something that deserves the name of greatness. And then it stopped. The fires went out. The plazas emptied. The ceremonies ceased. The carefully maintained solar alignment of WOODHENGE ceased to matter because there was no one left to observe the sunrise through the gap in the posts. The posts rotted. The mounds were covered by vegetation and then by the silence of 3 centuries. And then the people came back, different people from a different world, across an ocean that the builders of Monk's Mound had never seen. They saw the mounds, and they could not understand them. They invented mythologies to explain them that had nothing to do with the people who actually built them. And for most of the time since then, the city has been invisible, not physically absent, because the mounds are still very much present, but invisible in the sense that matters, absent from the story of this place, unacknowledged in the narrative of what America is and where it comes from. That invisibility is ending. Slowly, imperfectly, with the friction of resistance from frameworks that have too much invested in the old story to give it up easily, but ending. The LiDAR data keeps coming. The excavations keep producing results. The ancient DNA analysis keeps revealing the deep history of the people who moved across this continent for 12,000 years before European contact. And the mounds keep standing, patient, enormous, waiting for the full attention they have always deserved. What does it mean to stand at Monk's Mound and understand what you are standing next to? It means understanding that the history of this continent is far longer, far richer, and far more complex than the version most of us were given in school. It means understanding that the Americas were not a wilderness awaiting civilization. They were a civilization thousands of years in the making that colonization disrupted and in many places destroyed. It means understanding that human achievement is not the property of any single tradition, any single lineage, any single cultural family. That the same species that built the Parthenon and wrote the Iliad and composed the Goldberg variations also built Monk's Mound and calibrated WOODHENGE and arranged 20,000 shell beads in the shape of a falcon. That these are all expressions of the same fundamental human capacities: curiosity, organization, ambition, the desire to build something that will outlast the individual life, expressed in different places, in different ways, using different materials and different frameworks. It means, finally, understanding that the story of America begins long before 1492. That the continent Europeans discovered had already been discovered, repeatedly, in detail, with an intimacy of knowledge that comes only from 12,000 years of continuous habitation. That the people who built Cahokia knew the American bottom in ways that no subsequent population has matched, because no subsequent population has had the same depth of continuous relationship with that specific landscape. The mounds are still there. Every year, archaeologists learn more. Every new LiDAR survey reveals features that were invisible to previous investigation. Every new excavation produces artifacts and skeletal remains and architectural evidence that adds detail to the picture. Every new isotopic analysis of ancient teeth tells us something about who ate what, where they came from, how far they traveled. Every new ancient DNA result illuminates another corner of the demographic history of a continent that has been inhabited for longer than most people realize. The story of Cahokia is not finished. It is barely begun, in the sense that the evidence still being recovered by active research continues to revise and expand the picture in ways that keep the story moving forward, keep the city growing in our understanding, keep the achievement of its builders becoming more clear and more impressive with each passing year of investigation. What is finished, what cannot be sustained any longer by any honest encounter with the evidence, is the old story, the story of the empty continent, the story of the primitive wanderers awaiting civilization from across the sea. The story in which Monk's Mound is an anomaly, a curiosity, something to be explained away rather than fully reckoned with. That story is done. In its place, we have Cahokia, a city, a civilization, an expression of human genius in the mud of the Mississippi River Valley, built by people who knew the sky and the earth and the relationship between human community and cosmic order with a sophistication that took their specific tradition thousands of years to develop. The sun still rises over Monk's Mound on the spring equinox. The alignment still holds. The earth still remembers the geometry of the city that was built upon it. It is time for the rest of us to remember, too. If this film has moved you, if the story of Cahokia has changed something about how you understand the history of the land you live on, then there is something you can do. Visit the site. Cahokia Mound State Historic Site is open to the public, free of charge, in southwestern Illinois. Stand at the base of Monk's Mound. Climb to the top. Look out across the American bottom from the summit of the largest earthen structure in the Western Hemisphere and feel the weight of what was built here. And then tell someone. Tell them that there was a city here, that it was larger than London, that its builders watched the sky with extraordinary precision and built pyramids from the earth of the Mississippi floodplain and organized a civilization of tens of thousands of people without writing, without wheels, without metal tools. Tell them that the history of America begins long before Columbus, that this continent has a deep time, a deep history, a depth of human achievement that deserves to be known, honored, and taught. The mounds are still there. They are still large enough to make you feel small. They are still extraordinary enough to make you feel awe. And the civilization they represent, the civilization that was here before, the civilization that terrified no one because no one from the old world was present to be terrified by it. But that should inspire in all of us that same vertigo of encountering human achievement at a scale and a depth we were not prepared for, is waiting to be fully seen. See it, remember it. Because forgetting it, continuing to tell the story of this continent as if it began with European arrival, is not just a historical error. It is a human impoverishment, and we have been impoverished by it long enough.